Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scott Bertram.
We continue a series of episodes from presentations delivered at Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence seminars. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offers educators the opportunity to deepen their content knowledge and refine their skills in the classroom. These one-day conferences are hosted during the academic year in cities across the nation and feature presentations by Hillsdale College faculty, K-12 office staff, and leaders in the Hillsdale network of member schools. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series exploring the art of teaching a variety of subjects. To learn more about upcoming events, visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu.
Today, I want to say a few words about the relationship between modern science and the older tradition of education in the West that we call classical education. And I think in many ways this can be a difficult topic to approach. There's almost a language barrier between modern science and the classical tradition. There's technical language involved in each of those, but the language was developed by people living as much as 2,500 years apart. Right? And so it can be difficult, I think, to find some common ground. But the tendency to shy away from that issue means that there's a lot of internal disagreement and confusion that goes unnoticed. And our collective vision for education is worse for that. Among those who do comment on the relationship between modern science and the classical tradition, I think there's kind of a spectrum of opinions situated between two poles. Right? On the one side, you have kind of the optimistic view. Right? This is the view that rests on the principle that truth doesn't contradict truth. Right? Science is the study of nature, and classical education is meant to be an education which is based on human nature, insofar as it follows the natural order of learning and also pursues the goods that we desire by nature. So it seems that they should go together, right? They're compatible. Science is the study of nature and classical education is based in nature. The problem with that is that the word nature means very different things in modern science and for the classical, philosopher, right? And so the argument doesn't simply follow as easily as that. On the other side of this spectrum, you have the pessimistic view. Right? The pessimistic view is often held by those who are aware that modern science in some way is the daughter of modern philosophy. Those two things arose together and not accidentally. And so for this person, often a humanities sort of person, to see new state standards in science coming in or to see new AP classes being added in the high school, it can look like so many wooden horses being rolled through the doors, right? But there's a problem with that opinion too, because it's naive to think that the philosophical framework of modern science hasn't changed at all since its inception. In fact, there have been many revisions and developments in the philosophy that underlies science, especially within the last century. So the question of the compatibility of science and the classical tradition, I think, is more nuanced than is often thought. We can't have an easy answer to the complex problem. But it's an important question to resolve. First, to ensure that we're teaching science truthfully, but secondly, because it bears heavily on how we understand human nature and how we pursue the human good, especially in our own modern world, which is formed largely through science and technology. So since the main question is ultimately about the degree to which modern science essentially participates in modernity, I want to speak about three things. So first, I want to begin with a brief description of what I take to be the modern spirit. Second, I want to look a little bit at the influence which the modern spirit had on the development of science during the scientific revolution and later in the Age of Enlightenment. And finally, I want to consider a few points concerning the more current state of science, focusing especially on how I think it has advanced beyond its original philosophical framework. Okay. So first we ask, what is the spirit of modernity? What is its aim, its animus, its driving force? And I think in trying to define that, we have to proceed with caution, right? It's easy to read our own definitions and ideas and categories back into history. But it's clear that the early modern thinkers themselves, they perceived themselves to be part of a distinct movement. They had a will for change and a conscious desire to break with the past. A sign of that desire, that spreading mood, is the kind of fascinating shift in language that occurs in the 16th and 17th century in Europe and a little bit earlier in Italy. The shift in language is that the word new becomes a positive descriptor, right? That sounds normal to us. When we think of the new thing, it's always the best. That's why we have so many versions of the iPhone, right? That was also true for the early moderns. The word new represented something very positive. That has not been the norm throughout human history, right? That novelty has been a positive descriptor. In fact, the opposite has been the case. The new was typically regarded with suspicion. In the Greco-Roman world, the highest recommendation for any particular view or maxim or practice was its reputed antiquity. That began to change primarily as the Middle Ages waned, I think, and people grew impatient with modes of thinking and categories that seemed to be stagnant. And we can get a sense of the cultural mood of early modernity just by looking at some of the titles of the great works written at the time. You have Francis Bacon's New Organon and New Atlantis, Galileo's two new sciences, Kepler's New Astronomy, Erasmus's New Key to Learning, Boyle's New Experiments. Right? To sell a book in early modernity, you put new in the title. So for those early moderns, innovation offered a chance to break with the ancient idols and to start mankind on its true path. Right? At least that's what they understood themselves to be doing. Well, what was that true path? Were the early moderns simply iconoclasts, seeking anything that was new and different from what had come before? Or is there some definite project, a common thread among these thinkers? We certainly can't trace a complete thread, but I think that we can see something essential if we examine its origins. So René Descartes is often considered to be the father of modern philosophy, but I think Leo Strauss comes a little bit nearer the mark when he bestows the dubious honor on Machiavelli instead. That Machiavelli in some way is the first of the modern philosophers. Now, Machiavelli does not offer anything like a complete philosophical system, but he is the first one to make an effort to open a new route, as he says. He says he wants to open a new route which has not been followed by anyone. Right? So this is the novelty that the early moderns seek. And I'm not sure, but if I read Machiavelli correctly, that new route seems to consist primarily in his transformation of political philosophy into art. So political philosophy for the moderns becomes an art. And so for the first time, the winds of fortune and chance are thought to be partially susceptible to men's control. That's largely his project in The Prince. That attempt to master fortune, though, that's something that Machiavelli limits to human affairs. Right? The means of conquest, he suggests, are solely political. And Machiavelli recognizes that there's really little that we can do to protect ourselves against ill fortune as it comes to us from nature outside of the political realm. So he resigns himself to the human condition in the natural world and is content to carve out as much security and power as possible within the polis. Machiavelli's greatest disciple, Francis Bacon, however, was not so meek. And I think we often don't think of Machiavelli as meek, but I think compared to what Francis Bacon is doing, there's some truth in that. Bacon recognized that fortune or chance, the fortune and the chance that's most harmful to man comes not from other men, but from nature. So things like the shortness of life, the vulnerability to disease, the weakness of old age, and so on. Those are the true threats to human existence, to human life. And so Bacon embarked on the project of eliminating chance from the nature of things. a project that Machiavelli might well have considered mad. Right? In his new Organon, Bacon goes so far as to universalize the range of mastery to what he says is lordship over the universe. Isn't that amazing? That's what Bacon pursues, is lordship over the universe. And he places his hope in attaining that goal in the methods of science, which he believes he's just recently developed. Okay. So at the roots of modernity, then, as many have noted before me, I think we find a clear, conscious, and a novel impulse for mastery and control. There's, among those early modern thinkers, there's a shared unwillingness to be at the receiving end of fortune. Right? There's a desire to be emancipated from any kind of influence or formation or definition that isn't preceded at least by consent, if not by outright agency. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, right? We can say now that by erecting a defense against suffering, the modern thinkers also shielded themselves from grace. And in subsequent centuries, I think we developed a new relationship with the world in which we do not need to be conformed to it. Rather, it conforms to us through the unlimited extension of our own art. So that's a theme that originated in the minds of Machiavelli and Bacon, but it's not difficult to trace the further development through Hobbes and Descartes and Locke and Hume and Kant and Marx and beyond. And it's still with us. I think that impulse to control has now become a basic fact of everyday life. The modern political project, in some senses, no longer a city in speech, right? There's a German sociologist by the name of Hartmut Rosa, and he's made this ubiquitous modern experience of the impulse to control the primary object of his study and his ongoing research. Rosa notes that we tend to encounter everything in the world as points of aggression, is his phrase. Everything in the world for us is a point of aggression. In his book called The Uncontrollability of the World, Rosa illustrates how that modern attitude of control saturates our daily life. He says, this is kind of a long quote, sorry, but it's good. It says, we climb onto the scale. We should lose weight. We look into the mirror. We have to get rid of that pimple, those wrinkles. We take our blood pressure. It should be lower. We track our steps. We should walk more. Mountains have to be scaled, tests passed, career ladders climbed, places visited and photographed, books read, films watched, and so on. More and more, for the average late modern subject in the developed Western world, everyday life revolves around and amounts to nothing more than tackling an ever-growing to-do list. Everything that appears to us must be known, mastered, conquered, made useful. And Rosa concludes, the driving cultural force of that form of life we call modern is the idea, the hope and desire that we can make the world controllable. I think to most of us, it's probably obvious that a fully controllable world is not something to be grasped at. The most meaningful human experiences, it seems to me, come from things that are at least partially uncontrollable. Things like love and beauty, and sacrifice and gift and birth and death, right? I think we recognize that a world which is fully known, in which everything has been planned and mastered, would be terribly comfortable, right? I think that's a good phrase to consider, terribly comfortable. It's a world free of resistance and spiritually dead, a world devoid of both meaning and mystery. Apart from that sort of experiential insight, though, it can also be seen that the project of modernity is fundamentally opposed to the classical tradition, as we've been speaking about it. And that's because it replaces thinking with doing and ends up eliminating contemplation altogether. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher and student of Heidegger, she's very good on this point. She notes that the most momentous and unavoidable spiritual consequence of modernity was the reversal of the hierarchical order between the contemplative life and the active life. So she writes in The Human Condition, she says, the point was not that truth and knowledge were no longer important, but that they could be won only by action and not by contemplation. So for the moderns, the world is no longer something that gives itself to us, that reveals itself. Rather, if the world is to be possessed, it has to be taken. And that's the only possible method, is that we take it. In that modern framework, then, truth no longer appears to us as something given, but something to be made. And in a world where all truths are susceptible to man's power, there are no truths that are eternal. And that means also that there's no possibility of wisdom. Okay. So that modern spirit in its pure form, I think, is fundamentally opposed to the classical tradition. But what place does science have in all of that? So I think we can wonder, is there any sense in which what seems to be primarily the moral and political spirit of the modern age has influenced the study of nature? Good moderns that all of us are, I think we might tend to reject the question outright. Science is objective, right? The attitudes and the beliefs of the scientist are not supposed to play any part in the results. And there's some truth to that. That's part of the success of the scientific method, right, is that we're able to isolate certain things that we can consider to be objectively true apart from the preconceptions of the scientist. But I wonder if there's a way in which, even the sense in which we question nature, our very attitude towards nature, can change the interpretation of what we find in it, right? I mean, I think that the scientific method in and of itself, you see many presentations of this, but it always begins with observation, doesn't it? And we always assume that once the thing is observed, now you can ask a question, you can form a hypothesis and whatever other steps there are. But I wonder about that first step, observation. Why is that the first thing? Is it the case that the world just makes its impression on us kind of statically, and then we go from there and we start to question? Or is there some sense in which our approach, our attitude to the world in the act of observation itself partially determines what we're going to find? Ian McGilchrist is good on this point. He is a psychiatrist and something of a polymath. Are there still polymaths? He's something of one. He's become more popular in recent years. He says in his book, The Matter with Things, he says, attention changes the world. How you attend to it changes what it is you find there. So he considers attention to be a sort of lens through which we perceive, and that lens can change our interpretation of what we find. I was trying to think of some examples of this, and the first one that occurs to me is the way the world appears differently in love. If you consider the face of another person, a face of another looks very different based on whether you love them or not, doesn't it? You actually see something different there. Things that you didn't formerly think were beautiful now do appear to be beautiful. You notice different things that you had never seen. And it's in that very act of sight, right? The face of one's beloved looks different than it did before love. In a less romantic example, maybe you could also think about art. Imagine how a landscape appears to the artist as opposed to the one who's trying to travel across it. You see different things, you observe differently, right? When you try to draw something, you attend to it differently, and there's different parts of reality stand out to you. So there's something in McGilchrist's statement here that our attitude changes what we find in the world. So I think we can reframe the question and we can ask, how does modern science attend to the world? Does the Baconian spirit of control and mastery somehow shape its mode of attention and inquiry? And I think we have to wonder whether the impulse for control in some way determines what science can discover. Maybe we should think for a moment about a kind of hypothetical. We can do a thought experiment here. So let's say that the modern philosophers are right? By fiat. The modern philosophers are right. Nature is essentially and fundamentally controllable. I think we should wonder in that instance, then what sort of thing is nature and how would we come to know it? Right? So if nature is fundamentally controllable, what sort of thing must it be and how would we come to know it? I'd suggest that there are at least 4 assumptions that we have to make about nature that follow from that idea that nature is fundamentally controllable. In the first place, that notion introduces a fundamental split or a divide between the human as the controller and nature as the thing controlled. So under the hypothesis, consciousness and the world have to be fundamentally distinct. We can look at nature as a spectator, but we are not fundamentally involved with it. There's a physicist and philosopher by the name of Henri Bortoft who speaks to this. He says, "We have an impression of ourselves as being separate and independent from the world, detached from nature, which puts us in the position of being onlookers. It is this sense of separation that gives us the attitude which is necessary to be able to treat the world as an object to be operated on, manipulated, and organized. In other words, this is the condition of consciousness which is necessary for us to approach the world from our modern technological standpoint, both instrumentally and conceptually." So in order to act upon the world, in order to consider it something which is controllable, we have to understand ourselves as fundamentally distinct from it. There's a divide. Secondly, I think if we believe nature to be controllable, we also have to believe in a fundamental materialism. We have to think that what is most real in nature is passive matter. And the reason for that is that we cannot control most things in nature as they appear. Yesterday, I was driving down here from Michigan, and as I passed through Indiana, the winds were just whipping across the freeway. A huge storm whipped up. I had to pull to the side of the road for a while. When you see nature like that, it does not look to be fundamentally controllable, right? Nature as it appears to us, kind of on the holistic scale, doesn't look like something that can be controlled. But if what things really are is their matter, right? If the passive matter of things is the source of their being, then because we can control matter, we can in principle control all of nature. The example of thought, I think, is a good example. Thought seems to be something that we can't control, the thoughts of others. They're removed from us. We can't touch those things. But if we understand thought to be just electrical impulses in neurons, now that's something we can control. And so if nature is fundamentally controllable, I think we have to understand it through this lens of materialism. And that's what gives us this nothing but way of speaking. Francis Crick, one of the scientists who discovered DNA, he's famous for this quote, and maybe he didn't mean it as I'm taking it here. So, but the quote is good. He says, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Right? That's the kind of materialist statement that needs to be true for the modern project to succeed. Right? And the reason is that chemicals and electrical impulses and cells are controllable. Emotions and thoughts and organisms are not as such. Notice, by the way, Emily was talking about this earlier too, how our very language expresses this assumption. The materialistic tendency is present in the very way we speak. I have in my backyard a saltwater pool. Okay, and over the summer, my oldest son was asking me. He knew that it's chlorine that cleans the pool, so he was wondering, well, how does the salt become the chlorine in the pool? And I said, well, see, the salt is actually sodium and chlorine. And when the sunlight hits it and splits it apart, then you get free chlorine in the water. And then I caught myself because what did I say? I said, salt is actually sodium and chlorine. No, it's not. Salt is potentially sodium and chlorine, which you can get out of it, but it is in fact salt. But it's that kind of language, that dangerous word really, the dangerous word actual. We think that what is actual is the material passive constituents of the thing, and that's the true thing. The salt is kind of just an appearance, something we have to get behind. Okay. So for nature to be controllable, I think it has to be fundamentally divided from the mind, and then we also have to believe that what is most real in it is its passive material elements. Notice, though, that if that's the case, then nature becomes a big problem for anybody trying to know it. If the mind is from the beginning separate from the nature it's trying to know, then we don't know it from the beginning. And if what's most real in nature is the material elements, then the appearances of things are illusions. And so knowledge of nature then can only be obtained, again, by reaching back behind those appearances or illusions, by delving beneath the phenomena and forcibly reducing the wholes to their most basic elements. So a materialistic science, then, I think necessarily also has to become a reductive one, right? So to understand nature as controllable, we have to understand ourselves as divided from it. We have to understand it through materialism and also through a kind of reductive method. But I think we can go one step further. There's one more assumption that we have to make to think that nature is controllable. Any science that arrives at the true material elements must still provide some explanation for the perceived phenomena, for the appearance of the whole, right? So our science might be able to analyze to the smallest material elements, but then we still have to explain how did that give us the vision of the whole? How do we explain our initial experience of the thing? And since the material parts we understand under hypothesis are more real than the whole, then that means that they can only come together in a kind of accidental unity through outside forces, right? So in other words, all natural phenomena can be explained as mechanisms. They're nothing more than what's also producible by human art, because isn't that what an artifact is? An artifact is an accidental assembly by extrinsic forces of parts that are themselves more real than the things they're assembled into, right? So if this is what science is, if the modern spirit fully enlivens science, then it seems that we have to assume the separation between mind and matter. We also have to assume a fundamental materialism, a fundamental reductionism, and a mechanistic paradigm for knowledge. So is that how science has proceeded in the modern age? By and large, I think it was, following Machiavelli and Bacon. And many, perhaps most scientists were not truly materialists, but there's a way in which that modern spirit is impressed upon the methods and the practices of modern science, even if it was never directly a part of their content. So Descartes, of course, was the first to provide a philosophical grounding for the separation of mind and the world. So he inserts that abyss, that gap, that divide. Newton's laws of motion can actually take us the rest of the way, I think. Right? It was the first law of motion. It's the law of inertia, the most basic thing to be known about nature. And the upshot of it, speaking not very technically and precisely, but the upshot of it is that nature is fundamentally passive. It's inert. It's susceptible to control. Right? And Newton's second and third laws of motion introduce the notion of force. And that's a means of human agency which can elicit a determinate reaction from matter and thus render it essentially manipulable. There's a way in which we could read those three laws of motion as saying essentially, look, matter doesn't do anything unless we make it, and then it will act in a completely determinate way. Now, I don't think that's how Newton intended the laws exactly, but I also don't think it's an accident that together Galileo, Descartes, and Newton provide the instructions for acquiring knowledge of a nature that's essentially controllable. Again, that's not to say that all scientists participated consciously in that modern project. It's perfectly possible to seek greater control over nature without making this ontological claim that nature is essentially controllable. But what most great scientists know is a partial explanation of the world. Many modern philosophers, and I think the popular culture, take to be a complete account of reality. And in our general understanding, this is what science has come to mean. Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World and ever something of a prophet, he wrote about this in a 1946 essay entitled Science, Liberty, and Peace. Again, this one's a little bit long, but Huxley is so good. He says, as a representation of reality, the scientific picture of the world is inadequate, for the simple reason that science does not even profess to deal with experience as a whole, but only with certain aspects of it in certain contexts. All this is quite clearly understood by the more philosophically minded men of science. But unfortunately, some scientists, many technicians, and most consumers of gadgets have lacked the time and the inclination to examine the philosophical foundations and background of the sciences. Consequently, they tend to accept the world picture implicit in the theories of science as a complete and exhaustive account of reality. They tend to regard those aspects of experience which scientists leave out of the account because they are incompetent to deal with them, as being somehow less real than the aspects which science has arbitrarily chosen to abstract from out of the infinitely rich totality of given facts. Okay. So what are we to do? Culturally, this places us in a difficult situation, right? C.S. Lewis was mentioned earlier. As he recognized and warned us in The Abolition of Man, modern materialist philosophy appears to be essentially self-destructive. And Lewis himself was not overly optimistic about any forthcoming solution. He says, is it possible then to imagine a new natural philosophy, continually conscious that the natural object produced by analysis and abstraction is not reality but only a view, and always correcting the abstraction? I hardly know what I am asking for. So Lewis's concern there is valid, but I would cautiously suggest that there's perhaps greater cause for hope than Lewis realized at the time. So the fact is that while our culture continues to push forward with this modern project and, in a sense, the recreation of man in his own image, science as such is no longer what drives this, I believe. The fact is that the notion that materialism is the philosophy of science is an idea from a bygone era. Right? It remains in vogue among non-scientists and technicians, but in truth, I don't think that science as a whole has been materialist for well over a century. Not only has it advanced in technique and knowledge and so on, but it's also progressed in developing a much more robust and I think a more realistic philosophy. So where this modern philosophy bent science into a kind of dualistic, materialistic, reductive, and mechanistic paradigm, scientists in the last century, I think, have successfully dismantled each one of those assumptions and in nearly symmetrical order. A lot of that work has taken place in the realms of physics and chemistry, but I think that there's also something of a philosophical revolution going on in biology right now, and has been for at least the past few decades. So let me give some examples of how this is being overturned. Where Galileo and Descartes, they set up the framework for modern science by separating the consciousness from nature, right? Now we know, or we believe, that mind must be involved in every observation and experiment. And we saw that in two different areas at the beginning of the 20th century. First in 1905 with Albert Einstein. He showed us that space-time and the laws of motion can be defined only by reference to an observer and his or her physical conditions. So in other words, the scientist could no longer consider himself a detached spectator, as in the Newtonian system. And it was a similar revolution that occurred in particle physics not long after. At subatomic scales, the very act of measurement, we know, right, produces an unpredictable change in the state of the particle. The physicist John Wheeler sums this up nicely. He says, the choice one makes about what one observes makes an irretrievable difference in what one finds. The observer is elevated from observer to participator. What philosophy suggested in times past, the central feature of quantum mechanics tells us today with impressive force. In some strange sense, this is a participatory universe. Again, where the moderns assumed that the material elements of natural things are most real, many, not all, but I think many now believe that something closer to the opposite is true. Werner Heisenberg, who is one of the fathers of the quantum revolution, he attributes the probabilistic quality of subatomic physics not to any imprecision in the measurement, but to an inherent indeterminacy in matter itself. He writes, in the experiments about atomic events, we have to do with things and facts, with phenomena that are just as real as any phenomena in daily life. But the atoms or the elementary particles themselves are not as real. They form a world of elementary potentialities or possibilities, rather than one of the things or facts. And in another place he universalizes that claim. He says, the ontology of materialism rested upon the illusion that the kind of existence, the direct actuality of the world around us, can be extrapolated in the atomic range. This extrapolation is impossible, however. Okay. So he's arguing against that fundamental materialistic mindset, and he believes that quantum mechanics is one sign that we need to move beyond that. We can go further, where the moderns thought that nature could only be known by reaching behind appearances, reducing phenomena to their fundamental elements. Now we believe that those reductive explanations are necessarily incomplete. And I think it's the consequences of quantum theory in particular that reaffirm the priority of everyday world, which we experience through the power of our senses to reveal the truth of reality. Heisenberg again articulates this one nicely. He says, previously physics had attempted to treat processes accessible to our senses as secondary and derived, and to explain them in terms of events on an atomic scale. These events were considered to be the hidden objective reality. However, we now recognize that even events accessible to our senses, with or without the aid of scientific apparatus, can be considered objective. Okay. And finally, where the moderns imagined that nature is built like a machine, its material elements accidentally joined through extrinsic forces into artificial wholes, we know now that that's an inaccurate and inadequate portrait of reality. And as such, our explanations of nature must include not only mechanistic models, but also more holistic methods. Einstein notes, in relation to this point, he says, science did not succeed in carrying out the mechanical program convincingly, and today no physicist believes in the possibility of its fulfillment. So I think all of this suggests that while the moderns have certainly demonstrated that nature is indeed controllable beyond the wildest dreams of pre-modern thinkers, there's ultimately more to nature than what can be controlled. And the evidence we see again and again from the leading scientists over the last century is that the reductio that began with Machiavelli has finally reached ad absurdum, right? Current science has, for the most part, rejected that philosophical materialism that belongs to the spirit of modernity, and which is also incompatible with the classical tradition. This is, I think, a hopeful picture, because it suggests that we may indeed live in a world which is saturated with meaning and mystery. And it's a hopeful thing, too, to discover that the human mind is not the greatest thing in the world. What this means is that we, science teachers and scientists, we need to find new ways of attending to nature as it reveals itself to sense perception. I think we need to find new modes of insight that grasp what is real and essential in phenomena. And we need new forms of description that are grounded in common notions in daily life and human language. What we need in education is a new spirit of science. And that's something that I think current science, coupled with the classical tradition, can discover. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this lecture, we encourage you to visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu, for additional information on upcoming Hoogland Center events and other free resources for educators.